Hey there, Legal Tea listeners. This is your host, Jenny Roselle. Today's episode of Legal Tea is a cautionary tale where we talk about real life cases, real clients. They are things me or my office have actually worked on. And for today's 99th episode, we're going to be talking about a few different stories, and dare I call them cautionary tales, that really exemplify some common estate planning misconceptions that I see and I hear all too often. And to clarify, they are called misconceptions because they are things people believe that are not accurate, or at least not fully accurate. So for today's stories, cautionary tales, we're going to go into four misconceptions, and I'm going to try to keep them relatively brief so that you can hear the story, hear the misconception, and then we'll dive into what is inaccurate about the misconception. So let's get into it. The first misconception is when I hear people say, oh, well, everything will go to my spouse when I pass away. That's not necessarily true, my friends. It depends on how you own assets and or the type of estate plan that you have, if any, and what it says. Like, there's a lot of ifs there, right? The only thing to make sure that, XYZ definitely happens is to ensure your assets and estate plan are set up in the most appropriate way and manner. So here's a quick story to share what I mean. Let's call the clients John and Nicole. They were recently married in their late 30s, and tragically, John got a terminal cancer diagnosis. Of course, both thought they had long lives ahead of them before this diagnosis. And then when the diagnosis came down, there was so much happening, like so many doctor's appointments, procedures, etc., that they failed to stop and think about estate planning. They just kind of assumed that it would all go to Nicole. If something happened to John, that it would all go to Nicole. I'll never forget sitting in the conference room, meeting with Nicole, and ask her to share this, sharing her story with me. And it was after John passed away. After I inquired whether John had a will or any estate plan, she said no. And I asked, okay, do you and John have any children? She answered again, no. Then I asked, what about John's parents? Are they living? And she answered, yeah, they are. She looked at me kind of puzzled, like, why are you asking me these questions? Well, the reason is that Indiana states, and a lot of states, I would assume all states, honestly, state that if someone dies without a will, they go by something called intestacy rules that support individuals, because a lot of people don't do estate planning, right? And so there are state statutes that basically support people in this scenario. And in Indiana, without a will, and if there's a spouse and parents living, and here John's parents were living, a portion goes to the spouse and a portion goes to the parents. Weird, kind of, right? So I gently explained these laws to Nicole and shared that his parents, are entitled under the law to a portion of John's estate. And she immediately shared how awkward that would be to bring up to John's parents. Only awkward because keep in mind these weird money conversations are having to happen while Nicole is grieving the loss of her husband. And John's parents are grieving the loss of their son. It's not ideal. Thankfully, this story ends on a happy note. Nicole she ended up working up the courage to talk to John's parents, and John's parents agreed to waive their interest or disclaim their interest in the estate and let everything flow to Nicole. And remember, they did not have to do that. And I'm sure we can all think of people where the in-laws would not have waived their interest. Alrighty, let's go to the second misconception that we're going to talk about. And here's another good one. Oh, my spouse won't change the will after I pass away. Oh my goodness, that's a misconception, Jenny? It sure is. It sure is. The only surefire way to ensure assets are not changed is honestly through kind of more planning than just a will. and it's through a trust. And really what ends up happening with those is that you can place restrictions on each other as spouses on what happens after one passes away. But in this cautionary tale, the couple only did a last will and testament. So let's dive into the story. We're going to name them Ralph and Sarah. So Ralph had no children, but had a dear, dear niece. Sarah had a child. It was not with Ralph, it was from a prior marriage. So we get to chatting about who's going where, like beneficiary-wise, and honestly, the conversation got a little heated. Not super heated, but a little heated, because Ralph wanted his niece and Sarah's son as equal beneficiaries, and Sarah did not want Ralph's niece listed as a beneficiary at all. So ultimately, what ended up happening is Sarah sort of gave up and said, heck with it. And Ralph and Sarah, they did their wills, and Ralph's niece and Sarah's son got placed as the beneficiaries, after Ralph and Sarah both passed away, of course. Well, fast forward some time, and not long, actually, at all. I think it was maybe 6 months or so, and my office gets a call from Sarah. Totally frantic. She's totally frantic. And what the news was is that Ralph unexpectedly had passed away. Completely unexpectedly. It was a mere 2 days after Ralph had passed away when she called. I think it was on a Saturday that it happened, and she called on a Monday. And we got a phone call scheduled for the following day, Tuesday. So if you're keeping track, that's a mere 3 days after Ralph passed away. And on the phone call, Sarah kicks things off by talking about what changes she wants to make to her will. And that's pretty uncommon. Most of the time when we get this call from clients, they're really calling about questions of what can I pay? What can I not pay? Nope. Sarah here was asking about how to make changes to her will. And she was wanting to cut out Ralph's niece. And that is exactly what ended up happening. You see, everything asset-wise fell from Ralph to Sarah first. So at this point, it's going to be her will that governs when she passes. Honestly, too, Sarah is still our client. So if she wanted to make the change to the will, then just because we may not agree with it, maybe, if I don't agree with it, that doesn't mean anything. It's her will. She can do whatever she wants with her assets at her passing. So when it's time to do your own planning, remember Ralph and Sarah. Like I said a minute or two ago, let me be loud and clear. There are estate planning options that would have definitely prevented this. So yes, you can create an estate plan to prevent this very thing from happening. Unfortunately, it just requires more planning than maybe you want to do, but it definitely requires more than just a will. So Ralph and Sarah could have done more planning, through a trust, but more planning comes with a touch more expense, legal fee-wise, and they didn't want to spend the money. Well, the result of that decision is that Ralph's niece is not going to get anything. Okay, going to number three misconception in our third story. And so here's the misconception. Oh, my will take care of everything, all of my assets when I pass away. I only laugh because I hear these all the time. Okay, so there's one thing I have realized in my little lawyer world, that if it sounds too good to be true, there's probably some catch that you're missing. If it sounds too easy, you're probably missing something. And that's the case here. A will very well may not take care of everything. Because think beneficiary designations. And actually, let's just dive into the story because it will perfectly explain this. So a couple years back, I tragically worked on a case that involved someone that passed away that was young. Sherry was her name, or that's my fake name I'm giving her. Sherry, is her name, early 40s, single mom to 2 awesome kiddos. Sherry had done a will, good girl, just in case something were to happen to her. Her biggest asset was a life insurance policy. And she rented an apartment. So she didn't own a house. So she had that life insurance policy. She had a small bank account. And her total estate value really, did not rise to the level of needing probate. It was, pretty minimal. But I was meeting with Sherry's mom about what to do. following her daughter's passing. It was heartbreaking. And by the end of the meeting, somehow it got even worse. So I was talking to Sherry's mom about each asset one by one. When we got to the life insurance policy, she shared that it was a term life policy and the death benefit was $1 million. So of course I inquired about its beneficiary designation because the beneficiary designation is not going to flow through the will, hence why we're not having to go through probate. But anyway, so Sherry's mom said, for some reason, Jenny, she has me and her dad on there as 50-50 beneficiaries and not the kids. Well, her will, of course, left everything to her kids. Unfortunately, I got to be the bearer of bad news, so I had to share that the life insurance policy was going to go to her, like Sherry's mom, and Sherry's dad, and not through the will, which would have ended up, going to the kids. So that's when she laid it on me. Oh my gosh, Jenny, her dad is estranged. They've not talked for 10 plus years. And you'll never believe, just to keep this story kind of long story short, guess what happened? Well, Sherry's mom got her 50% and she handed it right over to her daughter's kids, her grandkids. The dad, he claimed his 50%, and after multiple attempts to contact him, he never replied, and he just got to pocket his 50%, which was $500,000, and he didn't share it with the kids, which were his grandchildren, technically speaking. But again, there was no relationship there. So please, please, please know and remember that if there's a conflict between a beneficiary designation and the estate plan document, the beneficiary designation wins. Isn't that kind of crazy? I've seen assets even go to like ex-spouses just because the person that passed away failed to update their beneficiary designation. Okay, let's do a final and quick number 4 misconception. And a story I guess there's really no super big story, but just a really big misconception I hear all the time. And it's more under the elder law side of my practice. And that misconception is, I have to wait, fill in the blank, 3, 5, 7, whatever, years before Medicaid will help pay the nursing home. Guess what? That's not always the case. So let's talk about it. Oh, the infamous Medicaid look back. Well, first, I hear people say that the look back period is 3 years. I've been doing this for about 12 years now, and it's never been 3 years in Indiana during my time. Now, since I do have Legalty listeners in several states, some states do still have 3 years. Here in Indiana, we're 5. I know some states are at 7. So I only mention Indiana because I'm an attorney in Indiana. So when I have a chance to drop an Indiana tidbit, I do. So yes, Indiana is 5, but for purposes of making it general, just use any number really as part of like a Medicaid application. Medicaid can look back, whatever your state's number of years for any gifts and transfers made by the Medicaid applicant. Now, I belong to an awesome national organization that supports estate and elder law attorneys like me and nationwide, and we all use similar strategies. So, across the board, this whole, I have to wait some number of years before Medicaid will help pay the nursing home. There are ways to deal with this. First, from a pre-planning standpoint, and second, from a crisis planning standpoint. To be best prepared, my friends, there are ways to do an estate plan years before any sort of need for long-term care, and that is best case scenario because we have structured assets beautifully to get ready for any future long-term care. Unfortunately, though, a lot of people do not pre-plan. They wait until the 11th hour, and in those situations, there are still ways to maneuver assets to not have to wait the whole number of years of your state's look-back period is. So one of my messages to you guys is that it's very, very fact-specific, family-specific, etc. So if you have a loved one possibly looking at some need for long-term care, please do not rule out Medicaid helping foot the bill just because your loved one did not plan. There may be a way to still protect assets and qualify for Medicaid. We do it all the time, all the darn time. My biggest piece of advice is seeking advice from an elder law attorney in those situations. Alrighty, let's wrap this episode up because I'm running out of time, and shift to a sneak peek of next week. So next week is going to be a lot different because next week is our 100th episode. I cannot believe I've been putting the blood, sweat, and tears, into this podcast for 100 episodes. As it may be obvious, I don't bring guests on my podcast where, I'm just interviewing people and guests. Conversely, my episodes require a lot of time to research and write out the episodes. It's basically a small paper I'm writing each week for you guys. So next week is not going to be anything substantive, no substantive information. I'm really just going to give a few announcements about what's to come with the podcast, reflecting back on, the last 100 episodes, just what I've learned about myself. And, maybe I'll do like a little giveaway or something for the 100th episode. But nonetheless, stay tuned, my friends. There are exciting times ahead. Thanks for hanging out with me for nearly 100 episodes, Legal Tea listeners. To 100 more.